Hi all! Today we are going to be digging into dirt, and specifically we're going to learn about why not all dirt is the same and why that even matters. To answer the question of why soil types are important, we first have to know what soil is even made of. So based on our previous unit on weathering and erosion, what is one component of soil that you've already learned about? Hopefully, you remembered that a big part of soil is tiny pieces of rock that have been broken down and moved through the processes of weathering and erosion. We call this inorganic material. Not organic because it is not living and has not recently been living. It is not derived from living matter at all. It is derived from rocks. After inorganic material, we also have organic material in the soil, things that are or were recently living. So this includes things like dead plants, fallen leaves, decaying animals, animal poop. All sorts of biological factors produce material that gets broken down and incorporated into the soil. The next two components are a little bit less obvious. Those components are water and air. And those two are very important to our survival because they're the reason that plants can grow in soil at all, even though we don't really think about them as being part of the soil. So why do we have air in our soil? Well, it's because the little pieces of rock and living matter, those inorganic and organic materials, they don't fit together perfectly, so they leave little gaps and spaces between them. And then if it rains or floods, water can soak into those spaces and get stuck there. So that can actually be a really good thing for plants because if plants could only get water when it was raining, they would dry out really quickly. But because the soil can hold some water for them, they have a more constant supply. So let's look at how that all breaks down. In this diagram, the orange slice, the biggest one, is our organic material. They call it mineral components here. But those inorganic particles account for about 45% of our soil. Another 5% comes from organic material. Then about half of what we think of as soil is actually space between the particles. And that space can either be filled with air or water depending on weather and other conditions. In a healthy soil that best supports plant life, about half of that space will be filled with water and half of it will be filled with air, although it can vary quite a bit. Because inorganic particles are the largest part of our soil, let's look a little bit more at those particles and what can be different about them. So the biggest factor in how these particles are going to affect our soil is not actually what they're made of, but how big they are. So we break down our inorganic particles into three categories based on size. The first one, which you're probably familiar with if you've ever been to a beach, is sand. Sand is the largest particle, and if you look really closely, you can even see them with the human eye. You can see individual grains of sand because they are relatively large. When you pack these particles together, they leave a lot of space between them. They don't fit together really well. And in fact, they leave so much space between them that when you pour a cup of water through sand, most of it will just run right out the bottom. Sandy soils are not able to retain water or nutrients very well because the spaces between them are too big. Our next particle size is silt. Silt particles are smaller than sand and they pack together more tightly. So silt particles will actually retain some water and some nutrients that filters through them. It doesn't all pass through very quickly. So silt soils are pretty good for plants. And finally, our smallest particle size is clay. Clay particles are actually so small that they have some kind of bizarre traits, and we won't go into too much detail about why that is right now, but what you need to know is that clay particles tend to fit into these sheets that layer one on top of the other, and they can actually form a watertight, impenetrable barrier. That's how we're able to have things like porcelain and clay bowls or pots that can hold water. So these are our three soil types: sand, silt, and clay. Now we're going to look at what those soil types look like in action. So while you might think that sandy soils just look like a giant sand dune, that's not always true. Most soils contain a mix of all three particle sizes, not just one. So a sandy soil that has some silt and some clay would actually be able to retain some nutrients and water, and so it can definitely sustain plant life, although it might be a little bit more sparse and deserty than an ideal soil for agriculture. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have clay soils. Clay soils look very different if they are dry versus if they are wet. They have very different behavior between those two states. Ideally, our clay would be mixed with sand and silt particles that would kind of balance it out a little bit, and clay soils actually hold the most nutrients of any soil type because they have very, very tiny spaces that easily trap things, but sometimes they can be too wet for plants. Finally, silt soils are kind of our Goldilocks. They tend to hold a good amount of water and a good amount of nutrients, but they're not too wet or too dry. As a quick review, answer the next 2 questions to make sure that we're ready for our lab tomorrow. So in class tomorrow, we're going to be looking at and feeling soil samples to see if we can tell if they have sand, silt, or clay particles, and we're going to talk more about why that's important for us.